The coach rattled in from the prairie as if the land itself were breathing it forward. Long gusts of wind pushing dust into soft spirals, the wheels singing a tired wooden hymn. Nathan Hale stood on the platform with his hat brim pulled low, boots lined up on the plank edge like he'd measured them against the heat-hazed horizon. He had shaved that morning with the carefulness of a man fixing a hinge on a barn door that must not fail. The blade had scraped away the softness, but not the worry. In his left pocket, a letter folded to the softness of fabric. In his right, a brass watch that had ticked too loudly all day. Beyond the depot, the afternoon lay down across the grasses in yellow sheets. Cottonwoods trembled along the creek as if something were whispering to them, and the bell on the coach gave one bright note that leapt the distance between town and open country, promising a change you could not unring. When the coach stopped, dust rose and came to a standstill in the warm air, a fragile veil that made the whole station look like a memory. The driver swung down, wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, and grunted such a piece of news as he believed the moment deserved, which was only hot road. Nathan nodded, though heat wasn't the only weight on the afternoon. His heart counted out measured beats, refusing hurry, refusing retreat. He had chosen this, and like most choices in a hard country, he'd made it with a clear eye and both feet planted. The door opened. A small shoe touched the metal step, paused and searched for courage. Then a hem appeared, dusty blue with the faintest embroidery along the edge, like stars you only see if you shade your eyes, and a gloved hand gripped the frame. The woman who descended did not belong to this grit and sun, not yet. She brought a bit of a winter coastline with her. Pallor, the shyness of fog, the hush of something held back. Her bonnet cast a shadow down her cheeks, and in that shadow the sheen of tears had already dried into traces. Nathan took off his hat and felt suddenly unequal to the work of words. In letters, he was capable. You could take your time there, pass sentences back and forth till they fit. Standing in front of a person, speech was a colt that could bolt any direction. He put his hat under his arm. "Miss Lark," he said, and the name sounded like a soft wing beat in a high barn. She glanced up, eyes as pale as the inside of a creek stone, blue worn by current. Her lips parted as if she'd meant to accept the name, and found it slightly foreign now that it had crossed into air between them. "Mr. Hale," she managed, every syllable wrapped in Boston paper. "It seems the road is longer than a map suggests." "Most things are," he said. The corner of his mouth wanted to be a smile if given permission. "May I carry your valise?" Her fingers tightened reflexively on the little case, then loosened, one instinct battling another. She passed it down to him, the leather warm from her palm. It was surprisingly light. In the letters she had claimed to be practical, to travel with little, to leave without dragging old rooms behind her. He had believed her then. He believed her more now, seeing the weight of what she did not carry. A few faces turned toward them from the porch of the store and the shade of the livery awning. The town was small enough that strangers were a public event, and private enough that everyone knew what a man like Nathan was doing, letting the coach decide an important piece of his life. Nathan moved a half-step closer to Miss Lark, not touching, simply bending the space between them so the staring had a harder path. He cleared his throat. "I brought a wagon. It's only a few miles." "We can have you out of this heat before the worst of it settles." "Thank you," she said. The gratitude was real, but threaded through with something she seemed intent on holding steady. The dust on her hem had made a brownish shadow of her skirt, and where it clung to the edge of her sleeves she looked like a watercolor left in the rain. He led her toward the wagon, waiting in a thin slice of shade. The mare turned her head as if to assess matters, and then, satisfied, hovered still as good horses do for new passengers. Nathan set the valise on the floorboard between the seats. He offered his hand to help her up, and felt her hesitate a second longer than manners required. Then she took it. Her hand was smaller than the work he knew, and the fine bones of it startled him. He had never thought of bones as delicate. On a ranch they were the practical structure of things, found white and honest in pasture grass. In his palm, fine-boned, felt like a promise one ought to keep. She settled beside him and folded her hands in her lap with a neatness that seemed less about propriety and more about self-containment, like she'd learned the art of keeping pieces of herself from falling where someone might step on them. Nathan gathered the reins, clicked his tongue, and the wagon started. The platform boards fell behind, replaced by the breathing road and the listless summer that hung on every fence post. For a time the sound of wheels and horse hooves did the talking. He let them. Silence often told the truth first. Out here, silence wasn't empty. It was a big room where you could hear what mattered walking around in the dark. A mile out, he tried again. We get an evening breeze that comes down out of the foothills, helps the house remember how to be cool. That sounds kind, she said, reaching for a word that matched air given as comfort. The city never learned that trick. It only knows how to press in. Cities are good at pressing in, he agreed. The land out here pushes back. Sometimes that's a mercy. She looked sideways at him then, the brim of her bonnet lifting just enough to let the light find her eyes. There was a flicker there. Interest, skepticism, a thought measuring whether the sentence could be trusted. Mercy is not a word I expected to meet on a road like this, she said softly. It lives everywhere, Nathan said. Some places hide it better. They passed under a chain of swallows, looping out from the eaves of a ruinous shed, up into sky, back to mud cups. The creek beside the road ran low and clear in late summer, its stones polished into good manners. Beyond the water, the grass accepted wind with that shimmering, combed look he'd loved since boyhood. He felt her noticing it all with him, but differently, like someone learning a new alphabet and whispering each letter in surprise. "Miss Lark," he said after another stretch of riding, "you don't need to dress the day in better clothes than it's wearing. If it's been hard, it can stay hard with me. I've no use for a performance on my account." Her hands, laced together on her skirt, loosened as if the tendons had been waiting for a specific instruction. The breath she let out sounded like she'd been keeping it since Cheyenne, perhaps longer. For a heartbeat, he feared the words might open a door to something that would spill and flood the narrow wagon bench. He braced himself, not to hold her back, but to give the spilling a shore to hit. "Forgive me," she said, and the refinement in her voice didn't make the apology prettier. It made it truer. "I told myself I would step down with poise and with a smile that promised you had chosen wisely. Instead, I gave the town a spectacle and you a tangle." She lifted her gloved hand, then lowered it, as if not trusting its steadiness. "Travel unravels me more than it should." He guided the mare around a rut, the wheels bumping the edge without complaint. "Travel tells the truth about what was already frayed," he said, and half wished he hadn't. He did not know her well enough to name fraying. He only knew his own. But she took it like a small glass of water and drank carefully. "Yes," she said after a minute. "That sounds right." Another breath. "I meant to tell you before we left the station. It felt too sharp for a public porch. I would rather not begin with a lie." He kept his eyes on the road, not to deny her attention, but to offer it in a way that did not crowd. Prairie had taught him there were looks that shepherded and looks that herded. "Go on," he said, and the words were so plain they sounded like the gate of a corral swinging open. "I was a music teacher," she said, and the smallest smile ghosted one corner of her mouth, as if even now, saying music arranged the air near her into kinder shapes. "I taught children whose hands were often sticky and whose minds resisted quiet. And somehow, with great effort, we made something graceful together twice a year in a church with poor acoustics. I would have stayed. I would have married in that city, likely, and made a life of pianos and little shoes running down hallways." Her fingers had come apart now, delicate motion tracing air like notes. "Instead, I learned what happens when a story told by the wrong person is believed by a room that wants to believe it." He didn't turn his head, but the muscles along his jaw did something that made the reins feel more like rope for a moment. "All right," he said, because rage from him would do her no good. "All right." He had learned that sometimes the kindest word available was a simple one that agreed to stand nearby. "I defended myself," she continued. "Of course I did. I asked reasonable questions. I suggested we look at evidence instead of whispers." Reasonable questions rarely calm a rumor, they only make it feel important. A small laugh that did not think well of laughter escaped. "I lost the school. I lost the rooming house. I learned the bitterness of people who had waited a long time to be disappointed by someone and had finally found a convenient candidate. I don't say this to win your sympathy. I say it because I wrote to you about music and steadiness and not about shame, and that is a kind of trickery, even if it was done from fear and not malice." A hawk showed itself as a darker comma in the light. It swerved and hung above a mouse's secret. Nathan watched it and kept his hands steady, the leather across his fingers warm and familiar. "What I asked for in my letter," he said, "was not a woman untouched by trouble. I asked for someone who could meet it and still see the sky. I didn't specify the route by which trouble would arrive." He let the mare choose the shallowest crossing where the road nuzzled the creek. "I don't require a perfect past," he added, softer. "I require a present that tells the truth." If she cried then, she did it without sound. Her shoulders loosened. Her chin lifted, as if the act of crying had nothing to do with collapse and everything to do with breathing, like the body's own summer rain. He stood guard beside the act by pretending to be preoccupied with a loose rain loop until the small weather passed. When the tears had dried into a clearer sheen on her face, she removed one glove and pressed the back of her bare hand under each eye with an efficiency that made him think of someone who had been in similar weather once or twice before and had learned the proper umbrella for it. The hand she lifted was not soft in the city sense. It bore a musician's strength, tendons like threads drawn firm. Somehow that fact made relief settle easier in him, the way a saddle sits right when you've found the honest notch. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded. Gratitude from the right people was a thing that did not need to be chased or hugged. It needed to be kept company, allowed to linger in the air until it laid down and slept by itself. He could do that. They crested the little rise from which he always liked to look at the place he'd made. The house was plain and squared to the weather, the porch deep enough to make a friend of the sun. A line of young cottonwoods traced the yard, still more ambition than shade, their leaves clapping soft applause every time the breeze remembered them. Beyond, the pasture reached east like a green sleeve and shouldered up toward brown hills. The barn roof had been mended in spring, the shingles dark as if rain had lived there once and left behind a story. He always saw the work still to do first. This time he tried to see it as a stranger might, a place that told the truth about its owner, the way a man's handwriting does, strong and a little austere, a fondness for order, a refusal to be pretty at the expense of usefulness. Miss Lark sat taller as the house came into view, as if posture were a tool that could equip a soul for what was next. He admired that about her. Not defiance, not submission, but a certain squared grace, the way a well-built chair will carry weight without complaining. They rolled into the yard, the mare dropping into that comfortable rhythm that says home even to a horse. The dog lifted from the shade beneath the water barrel and gave out a bark that sounded like a greeting disguised as skepticism. Nathan clicked him quiet and set the brake. He jumped down and turned, his hands up to help her before she had fully decided to take help again. She let herself be steadied. Her foot found the wheel spoke with less shakiness than he feared. When she reached the ground, the earth under them did its good old work, took some of the motion out of the day and returned it as steadiness. The front steps had been swept that morning at a nervous man's pace. He wished he had not polished the door latch. It sparkled foolishly. But the wildflowers in the jar on the porch table did not apologize for themselves, and their unpracticed loveliness saved his pride from over-effort. He carried her valise through the door and set it inside where the light made a long rectangle across the floorboards like something welcoming and particular. The room smelled of soap and of the pine shelf he'd planed 2 evenings ago into a smooth place where a woman might put combs. "It's not fancy," he said, and realized too late how men always say that when they have made an altar to usefulness and are suddenly aware that this altar might be read as poverty by the wrong eyes. "But it holds," he added, because that was the truth he wanted to offer a person who had come a long way to lean on something. She stepped over the threshold as if thresholds mattered, which they do, and her gaze travelled like a hand would, pausing on the mantel, touching the corner where the rocking chair sat with a quilt folded over it, measuring the distance from stove to table, noting that the window over the sink had been cleaned until it had a shine like a promise. He felt his chest loosen when she crossed to the window and simply stood there, looking out as if she and the rectangle of world outside were acquainting themselves. The yard, the dress of the hills, the sky in its careless wealth. Her shoulders lowered one notch, then another. "This is a house that respects daylight," she said. The oddness of the sentence delighted him. "And the wind," she added. "It appears you have made some sort of agreement with it." "I've learned to listen when it speaks," he said. "And to close the shutters when it's in a mood." She gave a small, true smile. "That is all one can ask of any companion." He almost told her then about the way the porch took the first spring thunder, the way a steady chest takes the sobbing of a child. He almost told her about the fox he sometimes saw at dusk. Instead, he showed her the room that would be hers, clean, with a new coverlet pieced by Mrs. Wilmer at the store, and a vase of those same field flowers on the dresser. He had set the basin and pitcher out like first-day offerings and folded new linen on the trunk at the foot of the bed. The curtains were simple white. They moved slightly in the breeze as if nodding their acceptance of her. She touched the coverlet and did not make a sound. Then she lifted one corner of the curtain, looked out at the yard from a different angle, and let the fabric drop. He heard the whisper it made against the sill, and thought it sounded like agreement. He took a step back toward the door so as not to crowd the moment of a person deciding whether to stay. "Would you like water? There's cool well water and coffee I can heat, if you prefer." "Water, please," she said, and her voice found an easy register he had not yet heard. "I will wash and come down." He left her with the quiet and the kind furniture and went to the kitchen to fill a glass, to busy his hands with a task so old and simple it steadied anything more complicated that tried to rise. He wrapped his fingers around the glass and thought of how many firsts and last things a house sees. He remembered the one winter the stove had gone out at midnight, and he had stood there anyway, breathing into the room like a fool, as if breath had heat to lend. He thought of winter now, and of a second winter that might hold another breath beside his. When she came down, her hair was smoothed, and the slight dust that grief had left on her had been washed away. Without the bonnet, she looked both older and much younger, like someone who had taken off a mask and found her own face behind it. She thanked him for the water with the precise gratitude of a woman trained to be graceful and determined now to be honest. The dog, after a dignified pause, brought his nose to her hand and decided to accept her as a person of interest who would likely feed him at some point. He withdrew to the kitchen doorway with the air of a sentry relieved to have reinforcements. "If you wish," Nathan said, "you may rest before supper, or you may come see the lay of the place while it's still light enough to be proud of." "Walk me through it," she said. "I would like to see the work you have done." They crossed the yard. The sun came down through cottonwood leaves in coins. He showed her the well and the pasture gate that stuck sometimes, the barn with its corners braced, the chicken coop with the door he had moved higher so fox visits would be less successful. Or he spoke in plain words that admitted both satisfaction and the next task. When they reached the corral, the mare nickered and put her soft breath on Miss Lark's sleeve. She extended a hand without fear or fawning and let the horse read the language of her skin. "You ride?" he asked. "When I was a girl," she said. "My mother thought it unbecoming. My grandfather thought it obvious. I split the difference and became a musician." "That's another kind of riding," he said. "You keep time for a body until it learns its own step." She looked at him then, and whatever answer she might have given disappeared into another small smile. He had the sense that they were beginning to collect small smiles, the way careful people collect kindling and lay it just so, ready for a flame when the night asks for it. Clouds had begun to gather earlier, the charitable kind that cross the sky like traveling families, and leave a blessing wherever they rest. By the time they came back to the house, the light had softened and found edges in everything. The porch railing, the jar of flowers, the curve of her cheek. Nathan lit the lamp more out of habit than need. The wick took to fire with the eagerness of something designed for it. The glass chimney glowed. "I can manage supper," he said. "I have stew put by. If you will accept a first meal that promises nothing except honesty, you can judge the cook and not just the kitchen." "I prefer honest to fancy," she said, and moved toward the cupboard like a woman willing to count plates while the pot warmed. He stood beside her as they set the table, reached around her once to reach salt, and in the slight brush of shoulders he felt the new fact of someone else. No ceremony, only the practical intimacy of two people moving through a narrow space with care. He ladled stew. She tore bread. The dog accepted a small corner from her fingers and then, as if aware of the importance of restraint on a first evening, curled at the threshold like a promise that went unspoken because it was too easy. Nathan tasted the stew and found it better than when he ate it alone. He did not say so. He asked her about music and learned that her favorite instrument was whichever one had the most stubborn student attached to it. He said he had no ear. She said ears can be taught if hands are willing. He told her the creek sang differently in March. She told him cities keep time with shoes. They ate like that, with pieces of their separate worlds placed on the table beside the bread, and each thing broke open differently under that light. After they had cleared the plates and washed them, she insisted on drying, which made him feel like a man chosen for a middling waltz in a parlour and not a chore. He opened the door to the evening. The long ridge to the west had taken the sun down behind it. The afterglow lay along the horizon like a thin, gentle fire. He leaned a shoulder against the post and watched her step through the threshold, unafraid of the dim. She breathed the air and looked up as the first star put its spark into the high blue. "There's so much," she said, not as a complaint, not even as awe, but as an accounting. "Enough to start something," he answered. For a while they let the porch hold them up and the night go about its business. Somewhere a cow lowed, somewhere nearer a cricket tried a few bars of the old summer song. He felt the weariness of the day trying to climb his bones and settled his weight differently to keep it from winning too soon. When she spoke again, it was with that decision in it, quiet but made. "You said I did not need to make this day prettier," she said. "I don't intend to. But neither do I intend to make ugliness my companion if it will not pay its keep. I will do my share of work. I will learn the wind and the creek and the door that sticks, and if you still wish to keep me here by Sunday, I will stand with you in whatever passes for a proper place in this town and say the words that make a life." He didn't realize until then that his hands had been closed. He opened them, easy, like putting down fence pliers when the wire is tight enough, and let the truth of gratitude settle wherever it wished. He did not tell her she was brave. He did not tell her she was a mercy he had not known how to request. Those sentences would come in time if they needed to be said. He did the simplest, most radical thing he knew. He met her promise with an equal weight. "All right," he said. "We'll give the land and each other a week to speak their mind. If they answer yes, we won't embarrass them by arguing." She smiled. Not the practiced version, not the small, kindling kind, but something frank that touched her eyes and made him feel like he had placed a window in the right wall. She turned to go inside then, to the room with the clean linen and the flowers that had not wilted, and he stayed a minute longer with the porch and the new star and the knowledge that, for the first time in a long while, he was not the only soul making agreements with the night. He banked the lamp, checked the latch, and listened as the house learned her footsteps. It did not complain. Seldom do homes built true to their lines. Upstairs, a door closed with a modest sound. He stood at the foot of the stair and felt the quiet settle around him like a coat he had earned. When sleep came, it found him willing, and it found him mended in a way work alone had never managed. And in the room above, the woman who had carried music and rumors and a future as light as a valise, laid her hand over her heart and counted the steadying of it, the way you count measures before your entrance. Outside, the wind tugged at the cottonwoods with a practiced gentleness, and the first small coolness of evening crossed the threshold they had both stepped over, raw, unadorned, and sufficient. The sun had barely lifted above the ridges when Amelia woke to the quiet that belonged only to wide country. No carriages, no hawkers, no city bells forcing rhythm onto the day. Instead, the breath of wind sifted through the shutters, carrying with it the smell of prairie grass still wet with dew. For a moment she lay motionless, the quilt drawn over her, listening to the unfamiliar house stretch and sigh around her. A floorboard settled, a bird tapped against the sill, the dog shifted his weight below. And beneath those sounds, silence, steady as a heartbeat. She rose carefully, her feet brushing the braided rug he had laid at the bedside, and smoothed her hair with hands that still trembled faintly from yesterday's storm of feeling. In the wash basin she found water, cool as truth, splashed it over her face, and saw her own reflection clearer than it had been in months. This was not the face of a disgraced teacher in Boston, nor was it the mask she had attempted on the stage platform. This was simply a woman, far from what she had known, standing at the threshold of something she could not yet name. Downstairs, the scent of coffee met her before she reached the kitchen. Nathan was already at the stove, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the kind of man who made rising early look like an art instead of a burden. He glanced over his shoulder when she entered, eyes catching hers with that steady calm that had unsettled her the day before. Unsettled her because it was not judgment, not even pity, but something like recognition. "Morning," he said, as if the word were a gift. "Good morning," she answered, surprised by the warmth in her own voice. A cup was set before her, the steam curling upward. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her fingers, and watched as he moved about the kitchen with quiet competence. No wasted motion, no clatter. He worked the way he spoke, direct, without ornament, but not without care. They ate bread and preserves together, conversation light at first, the weather, the chores waiting, the nearest neighbour's farm. But beneath every sentence, Amelia felt the undercurrent of something larger, a negotiation unspoken. Was she strong enough for this land? Would she flee at the first real test? And could she, bruised as she was, believe that his steadiness was genuine? When breakfast was cleared, he offered to show her the ranch. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. Outside, the morning stretched wide, the hills burnished by sunlight, the fields carrying the smell of earth warming. Rusty bounded ahead, his bark echoing against the barn. Nathan walked beside her, pointing out the corral, the smokehouse, the spring that never ran dry. His voice took on a different timbre when he spoke of the land, quiet pride tempered with realism. This was no boastful man. He did not romanticize the hardships, nor diminish them. Instead, he spoke as one who had struck an uneasy but enduring bargain with soil, sky, and time. As they walked, she found herself listening not only to his words, but to the pauses between them, to the way he weighed truth before setting it free. When they reached the corral, he introduced her to the horses. The Palomino mare pressed its nose into her palm with immediate acceptance. Nathan smiled, really smiled, for the first time since she had known him, and the sight startled her with its warmth. A dimple showed at his cheek, softening the lines carved by sun and solitude. "You'll ride her," he said, "if you decide to stay." Her heart stuttered at the conditional. though it was spoken without pressure. She stroked the mare's nose, steadying both herself and the animal. "Then I hope she's patient." "She'll be what you need," he answered. His gaze lingered a moment longer than courtesy required, and she felt the air between them bend slightly closer, like fabric drawn taut. By noon, clouds gathered in a dark line across the west. They returned to the house as wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Inside, while he tended the fire, Amelia moved about the kitchen, finding bowls, knives, the rhythm of a household not yet hers, but welcoming her steps. They cooked side by side, awkward at first, then more natural, as if the house itself approved of two voices, two sets of hands. The storm broke overhead, thunder rolling across the roof, lightning flaring at the windows. Yet the hearth glowed warm, and their conversation, halting, careful but genuine, wove a shelter more solid than wood or stone. He asked about her teaching. She told him of children's small triumphs, of the music recitals, of the ache of losing it all. He listened as if each word carried weight, not interrupting, not dismissing, only sometimes nodding or narrowing his eyes in thought. In turn, he shared pieces of his own story, years working other men's land, the loneliness of building alone, the fiancée who had left him after the war. His voice did not falter as he told it, but she heard the echo of old wounds beneath his steadiness. Lightning lit the room in brief silver, and for a breath she saw them both not as strangers bound by arrangement, but as two people marked by past losses, daring to imagine something unspoiled. The fire popped, the rain drummed, and the silence that followed was not empty, but rich with possibility. When at last the storm passed, leaving the world rinsed and sharp, they stood together at the window, watching the prairie steam beneath the retreating clouds. His shoulder was near enough that she could feel the heat of him, a presence solid and grounding. She did not step away. That night, as she lay in the room he had prepared with such thought, the new quilt, the wild flowers, she turned over the day in her mind. She remembered the sound of his laugh when the mare had nuzzled her, the way he had offered truth rather than consolation, the way he had said she need not pretend. For the first time in many months, perhaps years, Amelia felt not only safe, but seen, and as sleep claimed her, she whispered into the darkness words she did not yet dare share aloud. "Perhaps I have not made a mistake after all." Morning unfurled itself like a ribbon of pale gold across the Wyoming sky, and Amelia rose before the rooster, determined to meet the day on equal footing with the land that had accepted her so cautiously. She dressed quickly in the brown work dress, pinned her hair with swift fingers, and moved downstairs, intent on proving that she would not always arrive late to what life here demanded. To her surprise, Nathan was already at the table, a ledger open before him, spectacles perched low on his nose. He looked up when she entered, and in the lamplight his face carried both fatigue and satisfaction, as though he had wrestled with columns of figures until they bowed to him. Coffee steamed gently at his elbow. He closed the ledger at once, as though unwilling to let business come between them. "You're early," he remarked, and though his voice was even, there was a quiet flicker of approval in his eyes. "I thought I'd begin as I mean to continue," she replied, gathering courage in the firmness of her tone. "There is work enough to share, and I wish to share it." He pushed the coffee pot toward her, the gesture simple, but in it lay an acknowledgement. She was not a guest any more, not merely an arrival he had yet to measure. She poured herself a cup, and for the first time since Boston, she felt her hands steady when lifting china. After breakfast, Nathan led her to the barn, where the air was rich with hay and the soft breath of animals. He showed her the cow, old Bessie, whose placid eyes regarded Amelia with a mix of indifference and mild amusement. Nathan demonstrated the milking with sure hands, then guided hers into the rhythm, his fingers brushing over hers to teach the pressure and release. The warmth of the cow, the surprising intimacy of his calloused hand guiding hers, the low murmur of his encouragement, all of it wove into a moment that neither of them could dismiss as ordinary. "You're a natural," he said softly when the pail began to fill. "Or perhaps Bessie is merely patient," she countered, but her voice carried laughter. And in his answering smile she felt a current pass between them, gentle, tentative, but alive. The hours unfolded with a rhythm she had never known in Boston, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, scrubbing the porch until the wood shone damp and honest. She found her body tiring, yet her spirit quickened, as though each completed task carved away another layer of doubt. Nathan moved beside her, explaining, advising, sometimes simply working in silence. His nearness was never oppressive. Instead, it was a steadiness she could lean against without realizing she had. By midday, they saddled the horses. Daisy, the palomino he had promised her, stood calm beneath the bridle, as though she, too, had decided to accept Amelia. Mounting, Amelia felt the old childhood thrill return, of freedom, of balance, of the world opening with each hoofbeat. Nathan rode beside her, his figure tall and assured in the saddle. The prairie stretched around them, vast and unbroken, and for the first time she understood the kind of courage it took to claim such space as home. They rode into town that afternoon, and Amelia's nerves returned as the buildings of Willow Creek came into view. The general store, the blacksmith, the little church, they all seemed to lean toward her with curiosity. People greeted Nathan with nods and words that carried respect. When their eyes shifted to her, she felt the weight of being observed, measured. But each introduction, Mr. Wilson, his cheerful wife Beatrice, Madame Bouvier the seamstress, softened her fear. These people did not know her shame. They welcomed her as Nathan's bride, and for the first time in months she was not fighting whispers, but receiving smiles. At the seamstress's shop, Madame Bouvier fussed and clucked as she measured Amelia for a new dress. "For Sunday," she declared, pins in her mouth. "The preacher will be ready. A simple gown, but elegant. A bride should look like more than her journey." Amelia blushed, but accepted the kindness. When she rejoined Nathan at the cafe for lunch, her nerves had settled into something warmer. They spoke of the townspeople, of how quickly strangers could become neighbors, and as he listened to her impressions, she caught a flush rise on his sunburned cheeks, as though her opinion of his world mattered more to him than he had expected. That evening, back at the ranch, they worked side by side preparing supper. She chopped vegetables while he salted the meat, their movements gradually finding a rhythm that felt less like duty and more like harmony. When their hands brushed as she passed him the knife, neither drew away too quickly. Later, after the dishes were washed and the lamp turned low, they stepped out onto the porch. The sky stretched wide, constellations scattered like seeds across dark soil. Rusty settled at their feet. Nathan leaned against the post, and Amelia found herself standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly, the question leaping out before she could catch it. He turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. "No, do you?" She looked out at the endless prairie, at the house behind her that had already begun to feel less like his and more like theirs. "No," she whispered, and in the silence that followed, filled only by the night wind, the truth of it settled deep in her chest. When she retired to her room, she did not feel like a stranger any longer. She lay down knowing that tomorrow would bring work, uncertainty and choices, but also the possibility of belonging. And as she drifted towards sleep, she realized that what had begun as desperation was slowly becoming hope. The wind shifted in the night and carried with it the smell of iron, rain somewhere far off, or the promise of it. By dawn, the sky wore a pale, warning grey, and the cottonwoods along the creek were already busy talking to each other. Nathan stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, reading the weather the way other men read newspapers. Amelia watched him from the doorway, fingers curled around the edge of the frame, feeling the prickle of nerves that came when sky and earth began working out some private matter between them. He turned and found her with that sure, soft glance she had come to know. "We'll have wind by afternoon," he said, "and maybe trouble in the north pasture. The last storm weakened the fence there." "I can help," she answered, before the old reflex to stay small could rise. "Tell me what you need." He hesitated, only momentary, not doubt so much as the careful weighing of a promise, then nodded. "We'll ride out after breakfast." The house moved quickly around their decision. Coffee, bread, a slab of salt pork crisping in the pan. Rusty paced between the kitchen and the door as if errands required a dog's approval. The routine steadied Amelia, but beneath it a nervous excitement gathered. Work in Boston had been clean and predictable, tidy stacks of sheet music, chalkboards, polished pews. Work here had edges and weather and animals with their own opinions. She wanted to be equal to it, not to earn a place, he had already given her one, but to keep it wide open with the measure of herself. They saddled Daisy and the roan gelding, and by the time they reached the north fence, the wind had begun to comb the grass the wrong way, lifting it into startled ripples. The posts were tired where the ground sloped toward the low draw. 2 rails had blown loose. Another leaned like a drunk who couldn't quite commit to falling. Nathan swung down, tested the geave with a boot, and handed Amelia a length of new board. "Hold steady," he said, not because he thought she couldn't, but because the words put them in harness together. They worked shoulder to shoulder, wrenching the rails into place, driving nails against a sky that grumbled in its chest. Twice the hammer slipped, once from his hand, once from hers. The second time she hissed and cradled her thumb, bright pain flashing through her knuckle. He reached for her hand on instinct, cradling it between both of his, turning it into the light to see where the skin had split. "It will bruise," he said, voice low, the wind lifting the edge of his hat brim. "You did not cry out." She managed a smile that wobbled and then set itself straight. "I was listening to your instructions about holding steady." His laugh landed warm between them. He didn't let go at once. In the hallway of a Boston church, that lingering touch might have been remarked and dissected by women who collected other people's moments in their hatpins. Here, beneath a muttering sky, it merely felt like honesty. They finished the repair as the first drops found them, fat and infrequent, the opening notes of a song with a long chorus. He whistled to the gelding and mounted, reached a hand for her to catch the stirrup leather. She swung up, and together they made for the nearest stand of cottonwoods to wait out the worst of the wind's temper. In that small shelter, rain smelled like coins and wet bark. He tilted his hat toward her so the brim dripped clear of her shoulder. "There's a trick to storms," he said, eyes on the horizon. "If you face them, they tend to pass over you faster. If you run, they follow and get mean." "People are the same," she said, surprising herself with the shape of the observation. "Rumor is a kind of weather, more persistent for being chased." He looked at her then, not startled so much as named. "You have faced your share." "So have you," she answered. They didn't make a vow in that tangled stand of trees. They didn't need to. The rain came in sheets for 5 minutes and then eased into something slower, like a tired apology. When they rode back, the fence held, and the land looked as if someone had swept it with a new broom. By late afternoon, the wind had spent itself, and the sky opened as if laughter belonged to it. Nathan checked the herd along the south slope, while Amelia returned to the house to start supper. She had just set the pot on the stove when Rusty gave a warning bark that wasn't alarm so much as announcement. The front gate creaked a familiar hello. When she stepped onto the porch, she found Martha and Joseph Brennan coming up the path, the kind of neighbors who arrive with a pie and leave with less loneliness. "Mrs. Brennan?" Amelia called, a happiness she hadn't prepared for loosening her voice. "None of that," Martha said, waving away formality with the pie tin. "I'm Martha until you're tired of me." She kissed the air near Amelia's cheek as if they had been practicing the motion for months. "We heard the preachers in on Sunday," she added, eyebrows lifting like a held breath. "Figured you might have room at your table between now and then for advice you didn't ask for and a roast you didn't cook." "We have room," Amelia said, meaning more than the table. Joseph's handshake was firm and dry. He smelled faintly of wood smoke, and the kind of pipe a man keeps for evenings when the work has left a polite hush in his bones. Nathan rode in as the Brennans were settling onto the porch bench. He dismounted with an ease that made Amelia aware again of the distance between a man at home in his own land and a woman learning to stand in it. He greeted their guests with a genuine warmth that smoothed the last of her uncertainty. Community was not a chorus he sang out of duty. It was a melody woven into him. They ate together, the roast tender, Martha's pie scandalously good. Conversation wandered through the small roads it takes when people are deciding how close to walk. Joseph asked polite questions about Boston, and impolite ones about the weather there that somehow felt friendly. Martha told stories of Willow Creek as if it were a younger cousin who had once been sickly, but had decided to live. When the talk turned carefully toward Sunday, Martha's gaze softened as it landed on Amelia's face. "A wedding has less to do with the preacher's words than people think," she said. "It's a workday promise. The words are a door you step through. The keeping comes after, when there's mud on the floor and something burning, and someone you love says the wrong thing at the wrong time." Amelia, unstartled by frankness, nodded. "I think I prefer the work to the door. Doors can be slammed. Work tends to only ask you to keep going." Martha's smile deepened into pride. "You too will do." When the Brennans left, night was pebbled with stars, and quiet had regained its rightful place on the porch. Nathan leaned his shoulder against the post and looked at her, not to demand an answer, but to make space for one. She met the glance and found, to her surprise, that there was no cliff edge in it, no sick drop. The decision had been making itself all day, in fence rails and rain and borrowed pie. She heard herself say, simply, Sunday. He nodded once, and something relaxed in his stance, as if his body set down a weight it had been willing to carry for as long as necessary. Sunday, he repeated, with the gravity a man reserves for weather and vows. The next 2 days slid past with a curious blend of bustle and stillness. Madame Bouvier worked a miracle with blue fabric and a string of pins. When Amelia stood on the little block in front of the mirror, she did not see Boston's ruined teacher or the woman who wept at a station. She saw someone else entirely, herself, but steadier, as if the land had pressed its map into her skin. Nathan, for his part, made a list at the general store, ordered beef on credit he didn't need to take, the banker would have approved any number he wrote, and insisted on flowers for the church, even though the prairie was already showing off. On Saturday evening, Rusty patrolled the yard with solemn importance as the last light went honey-coloured. Nathan oiled his best boots without flourish and shaved with the stubbornness of a man determined to meet the day clean. Amelia laid out the dress and the pearl pins her grandmother had given her and felt a small, unexpected grief for the girl who had once thought life would be neat and easy. The grief was not a complaint. It was a benediction for what had been, a thank you for what would be harder and better. Sleep found them both, but not before one last chore of the heart. He stood at the bottom of the stairs with the lamp turned low and listened to the house settle itself around her steps. She stood at the bedroom window and watched the yard blur into dark and whispered something only the cottonwoods heard. Morning arrived wearing clarity. The church bell was a steady, patient sound, not urgent, not triumphant, only resolute. People filled the pews with the purposeful rustling small towns know, fidgeting children shushed with clean handkerchiefs, hats adjusted, coughs politely smothered. The preacher's wife herded the flowers into civilized arrangements and nodded at their colour as if God's work might benefit from a little human tidiness. Nathan waited at the front and reminded himself that a man is allowed to be nervous when he's about to say something he intends to mean. He had faced bulls and blizzards and the dumb cruelty of years that took more than they gave, and yet the sight of the church door made his heart behave like a colt told to stand still. When Amelia stepped through, the room did what rooms do when a new colour enters them. It changed. The blue of her dress did not blaze. It harmonicked with the pew varnish, with the whitewashed walls, with the quilt of faces turned toward her. Nathan felt his own face assemble into something that could hold his relief. The ceremony itself was simple because it was crowded with important things and therefore had no space for decoration. Words asked, words answered. A ring exchanged that had belonged to a woman who had taught Nathan to plant beans and to leave a door unlocked when someone might need shelter. The preacher spoke a few lines about the work of love and the mercy of days that let you begin again. Nathan's hand held hers, and in that grip she felt not possession but a promise to carry and to be carried. When he was told to kiss his bride, he did so with the restraint of a man who knows intimacy is a long road and not a sprint. The kiss was soft. It said, "Let us start as we mean to go on." It did not set the pews whispering. It set the two of them steady. After, congratulations came in a gentle wave. Hands, words, the smell of punch and sweet cakes, the knuckles of children curious about a new woman's dress. Martha cried a little in the corner and then scolded herself for it. Joseph clapped Nathan's shoulder and murmured something about fences that hold. They rode home in the late afternoon with the world washed in that peculiar post-ceremony quiet as if every sound had agreed to be respectful for a while. At the gate, Nathan swung down, then lifted Amelia from the saddle, arms steady at her waist. He did not carry her over the threshold immediately. He stood with her in the yard where the wind had once smelled of iron, and where today it carried only the clean memory of flowers from the church windowsills. "Welcome home," he said, and this time the words did not hover uncertain in the air. They dropped roots. When he carried her across the threshold, she laughed, not high and girlish, but low and full, a sound that answered the creak of the door and the dog's delighted circle. The house met them like a place that had been holding its breath and finally let it out. Supper was already prepared in practical part. Martha had insisted on leaving far too much food behind, and they ate without ceremony, grateful as travellers. Night came down with deliberate hands. Nathan saw to the stock while Amelia washed 2 plates and set them to dry. He returned to find her at the window where he had found her the first day. The sight moved through him like recognition rather than novelty. He crossed the room and stood beside her, not touching. The yard lay dark and familiar. The porch post cut a faithful line between house and everything beyond it. He turned to her then, and this time the gravity in him stepped aside to let tenderness move freely. He lifted her face with a touch that asked permission, and then kissed her in a way that told the truth about want and reverence, about a man who had learned from storms to face what came and not to run. Their first night as husband and wife did not belong to the watching town, or to any leftover Boston rumors, or to the creak of stairs, or to the customs other people insisted upon. It belonged to the precise, careful, joyful discovery of 2 people who had chosen work and found wonder in it. He was gentle without being afraid, sure without being selfish. She was honest without fear of being small, hungry without apology. There was laughter where they had not expected it, and a kind of stillness that did not require silence. When they slept, they did so in the knowledge that morning would not take back what night had given. Dawn came, as it always does, and with it the common marvels: coffee steam, the friendly complaint of a hinge, the dog's nails clicking across the floor. Nathan woke first and lay still, not out of reluctance to move, but out of a desire to mark the particular feel of a day that begins with 2 breaths and 2 shadows. He rose, stoked the stove, and left her to sleep a little longer, the kind of luxury hard country allows to those who have earned it the day before. When she joined him, hair braided, eyes soft with the sweet bruise of joy, he slid a cup toward her and did not say anything that would make the moment posture. She didn't either. They had no need for speeches. The house could hear their quiet and understand it. The week that followed did not politely step aside for their newness. A calf slipped its pen and needed chasing. A letter arrived from Boston in a hand that made Amelia's chest tighten before she opened it, and then relax when she read that the city, in its usual way, had already moved on to other amusements. A section of roof over the lean-to complained with a rattle that meant repair. He mended it. She held the ladder and did not wobble. Once in the yard, he swore softly when a nail bit his thumb, and she laughed and kissed the injured spot with theatrical solemnity that made him shake his head and pull her close. They went to town on Thursday for the Ladies' Aid Society and feed, and Amelia found herself telling a story to a circle of women about a little boy in Boston who had refused to sing until he learned that voices made a family larger. The women listened, then nodded, and one of them, a narrow woman with a face like a kindly plough, said, "You'll do." On Saturday, they stood together at the edge of the new field plot, and Nathan talked about a second smokehouse he meant to finish before winter, and about a string of apple trees he planned to put in come spring. "You may laugh," he warned. "The land doesn't always cooperate with the calendar in a man's head." "I have no interest in laughing at a man's hope," she said. "Only intending it." He took off his hat and looked at her full, the way a man looks when the horizon he's loved alone is suddenly a shared thing. "We'll be poor in some ways," he said, plain and proud. "Time, finery, predictability." "We'll be rich in others," she answered, equally plain. "Milk warm from the morning. Neighbours who bring pies. A piano some day, perhaps." "A piano," he repeated, tasting the word as if it were a fruit promised and not yet ripe. He reached for her hand, then, not because it was required or romantic, but because the work of the day goes better that way. They set to marking the rows. The sun rose to its reasonable height. A hawk scolded the air, and then forgave it. Far off, rain assembled its next argument, and near at hand the cottonwoods agreed again to be patient. In the quiet that labour breeds, Amelia thought of the girl she had been, the one who had trusted rooms to be safe and words to be believed because they were true. She grieved her briefly, cleanly, the way one might bury a small bird found in the grass and then go back to work. She thought of the woman she was now, the one who had learned another kind of music, hoofbeats, fence hammers, the call and answer of two people who mean to keep each other brave. She looked at Nathan, sleeves rolled, hat shoved back, a line of concentration between his brows, and realized that love had entered not in a blaze, not as a rescue, but as a rightness that made the day stand up straighter. When they paused for water, he tipped the dipper to her lips first, and their knuckles brushed again and again the way small rivers find and find each other, until one day the map names them the same stream. He set the bucket down and nodded toward the house. "We'll build a porch swing," he said, "in autumn, after roundup." "We'll need it," she said. "For resting?" "For kissing," she answered, and the look he gave her then was a promise that work would never be an excuse for withholdings of the heart. That evening, with the light going tender and the dog asleep in a crooked heap of contentment, they sat on the top step of the porch that would someday cradle a swing. The land breathed that deep end-of-day breath, and their joined silence made a hymn of it. Somewhere in the grass, a cricket started and stopped, reconsidered, and then went on. The house behind them was no longer his or hers, or even theirs in the possessive sense. It was a thing they would steward, like a good tune or a field, made honest by use, made beautiful by patience. And if the wind shifted and smelled of iron again, they would face it. If rumour ever tried to find its way across 1,000 miles, it would discover that truth, when two people tell it daily in the living of their lives, is a wall higher than any gossip can climb. Night fell fully. He threaded his fingers through hers and squeezed once, a quiet language they had already learned. She answered with her thumb against his knuckle, a note that meant yes, still yes, again yes. Above them, the sky gathered its witnesses, and in the cool afterbreath of the day, their hearts held what their mouths did not need to say, that the choice they had made would be the ordinary miracle they would make again tomorrow, and the day after that, until even the cottonwoods knew it by heart. Winter had settled its long cloak across the Wyoming land, and with it came a rhythm Amelia had never known but quickly came to cherish. Mornings began with a breath that clouded in the frosted air, boots crunching over snow toward the barn, milk steaming into pails while Bessie gave her patient, low-eyed consent. Nathan moved with the same steadiness he always had, but now there was a lightness in him, a warmth that belonged not only to the fire they built each night, but to the life they had begun together. The days were shorter, but the hours they shared stretched long and generous. In the evenings they sat by the hearth, she mending shirts or knitting, he reading aloud from one of the few books he had carried west. Sometimes the words gave way to silence, and in that silence they found a deeper music, the crackle of logs, the shifting of Rusty at their feet, the sound of wind pushing against the shutters. Amelia began to think that perhaps love did not need grand declarations. Perhaps it lived best in these quiet fidelities, in the tender repetition of daily kindness. It was during such an evening, her needle dipping in and out of cloth, his voice steady over a page, that the truth broke through her chest before she could stop it. She set her sewing aside, pressed her hands together as if steadying her own courage, and whispered, "Nathan, I love you." The words startled even her, rising not from thought, but from a place deeper, like water that had waited long under rock and finally found a way through. Nathan stilled. The firelight caught in his eyes as he lowered the book slowly to his lap. For a moment, silence carried the weight of a cathedral. Then he set the book aside altogether, crossed the narrow space between them, and knelt at her feet. His hands, work-worn and scarred, took hers with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. "Amelia," he said, voice rough as though unused to tenderness spoken aloud, "I've loved you longer than I dared to name. Perhaps since that first moment when you stood trembling yet honest at the station and told me the truth, no one else would have dared to. I feared naming it would break it. But now I want you to know. I love you." She bent forward, her forehead resting against his, and their breath mingled with the warmth of the fire. That kiss, when it came, was no longer tentative or polite. It was an answering, a vow made in silence and sealed in heat. The days that followed bore the same labor as before, shoveling snow, mending fences that sagged under the weight of ice, preparing food for long nights. But each task seemed charged with a sweetness she had never thought to find in work. They teased one another gently, his mock complaint at her bread-baking better than his mother's had, her exaggerated sighs when he insisted on carrying heavier buckets, though she insisted she could manage. Their laughter, once shy and halting, now rang in the house with the surety of bells. In January, the town opened its small school in a converted storefront, and Amelia was asked to teach. At first, she hesitated. Would it take her away too often from the ranch, from Nathan, from the life they were building? But when he saw the light in her eyes as she spoke of children, of chalkboards and songs, he pressed her hand and said, "You should do it. The ranch will wait. Your joy should not." She accepted, and when she stood before her first class in Willow Creek, she felt not the ache of old disgrace, but the rising pride of a woman reclaimed. Spring thawed the land, and with it came new life. Calves bleated in the pasture, chickens hatched beneath Amelia's careful hand, and in the evenings Nathan's voice would carry across the fields as he called the herd. It was on one such evening, with the light soft and the sky washed in rose, that she told him she was expecting their first child. She spoke it simply, placing his hand over her still flat belly, and watched as wonder overtook him. He lifted her in his arms and spun her once, laughter breaking from him as freely as rain from clouds. That summer passed in a blur of work and preparation. Neighbors brought gifts, knitted blankets, jars of preserves, advice both wise and otherwise. Amelia sewed tiny garments with trembling fingers, often pausing to imagine small limbs filling them. Nathan built a cradle from oak, carving it with the same patience he gave to fences and roofs, though this task seemed to matter more than all the others combined. Autumn came, crisp and golden, and with it their son, James, named after Nathan's father. The labor was long, but Nathan never left her side, his hand steady on hers, his eyes anchoring her through each wave of pain. When at last the cry broke the night and the child was laid on her chest, she felt a love so fierce it nearly undone her. Nathan, pale and shaken with awe, whispered, "He's perfect," and kissed her damp hair. The months that followed were sleepless, untidy, yet threaded with joy. James's wails filled the night, but so did his laughter when he discovered it, a sound that made Nathan grin like a boy. Amelia taught her students with the child cradled in a basket by the stove, his small fists waving in time with lessons. Their home grew noisier, messier, more alive with every passing day. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Nathan prepared a supper by candlelight, while Martha Brennan kept James for the evening. They sat across the table, the year heavy with memory behind them and promise before them. Amelia lifted her glass and said, "A year ago, I feared I had lost everything. Now I cannot imagine any life but this one." Nathan touched his glass to hers and replied, "To us, to the family we are building, to the woman who showed up in tears and found the courage to stay." Later, as snow began to fall again outside their window, they sat before the fire, James asleep in his cradle, their hands twined together. The storm howled, but inside there was only warmth. Amelia leaned her head on Nathan's shoulder and whispered, "No more pretending ever." And he answered, "Just this, real, true, and ours." The fire crackled, the snow fell, and their love, born in honesty, tested by work and sealed by choice, shone brighter than the lamp, brighter than the stars, bright enough to carry them through every season to come.